William F. Buckley Jr. published the first issue of National Review in 1955, and it soon became the central journal of the new conservative movement. Buckley, wealthy, diplomatic, and skilled as a writer and speaker, found ways to bring together members of the disparate conservative groupings in America. National Review, from the outset, was staunchly anti-communist, anti-big government, and sympathetic to traditional values and virtues. Its libertarian and traditionalist contributors rarely saw eye to eye. But Buckley was able to prevent internal tensions from breaking out in public, and he tempted such luminaries as Russell Kirk and Whittaker Chambers into working for him. Buckley recognised, however, that he had to be careful to win intellectual respectability in the mainstream media, and he therefore refused to endorse the paranoid John Birch Society, whose members believed that the communist conspiracy was not just an outside threat, but had already taken over the United States government. He also rejected Ayn Rand's brand of merciless libertarianism. His brother-in-law, L. Brent Bozell, meanwhile, ghostwrote The Conscience of a Conservative, which Barry Goldwater used as the manifesto for his presidential bids of 1960 and 1964. Although Goldwater lost badly in 1964 to Lyndon Johnson, his campaign set in motion a conservative takeover of the Republican Party itself, whose effects became increasingly apparent in the 1970s. Well, William F. Buckley Jr. had the plenitude of gifts to turn disparate conservative intellectual groups into a movement, and to unify them around his new journal, National Review. He was the sixth of 10 children, born to an exceptionally wealthy, talented and ambitious family. He grew up in privileged circumstances despite the Great Depression. He was born in 1925. William's father was a millionaire in the oil business, and William himself grew up partly in Mexico, partly in Connecticut, and spent some time being schooled in both England and France, enjoyed regular European vacations, and was far more widely travelled than most children of his own generation. In fact, his childhood is sometimes a little bit reminiscent of that of the Ayn Rand heroes. He'd been showered with gifts and privileges, and yet he was determined to use his advantages to build a yet more impressive career of his own. I certainly don't mean to imply that in other respects he's a Rand character. He did some service in the army at the very end of World War II, but the war was winding down by the time he'd gone through officer training, and he never went abroad. Instead, he was demobilised out of the military and attended Yale University, and there he became the editor of the Yale Daily News, the campus paper. This was a prelude to his lifetime of journalism. He participated in the debate team, which competed very effectively, and throughout his life he was a very effective speech maker and debater, and for a long time the host of a political TV show, Firing Line, in which he'd interview and grill intensively political candidates of all colours. He was an excellent interviewer, equally effective in speech and in writing. He had a massive vocabulary, a lightning-fast wit, and good at coining pungent epigrams. His first book was called God and Man at Yale, and written just after he graduated, and it condemned his alma mater for denigrating Christianity and capitalism. Buckley wrote in that book, Yale was founded by Christians and it was supported by capitalists. And so it seemed to the author that it was outrageous that by his day, the late 40s and early 50s, the economics professors should be teaching Keynesianism or various forms of socialist economics, while the philosophy and religion departments cast doubt on orthodox Christian faith. But in this book, Buckley construed the idea of academic freedom narrowly. His view was, it might be permissible to give the faculty the right to do whatever they like in their research and writing and to go where their research takes them, but surely when they're teaching, they ought to be passing on the heritage which gave rise to Yale in the first place and has sustained it ever since. The central claim made in the book is embodied in this sentence. He wrote, "The duel between Christianity and atheism is the most important in the world. And the struggle between individualism and collectivism is the same struggle reproduced on another level. The book came out right in the middle of the McCarthy period, and so at once it was recognised as having a family similarity to some of McCarthy's remarks. Certainly the book infuriated many Yale faculty, and angry reviews came out in the dozens, particularly from Yale alums who are now themselves in public life. One of them was written by McGeorge Bundy, who was then the dean of the faculty at Harvard and was later on to be a senior appointee in the government of Lyndon Johnson. Bundy called Buckley a twisted and ignorant young man. Well, after college, Buckley, who was fluent in Spanish, served briefly in the CIA in Mexico as an undercover agent. But he wasn't the type of man to go into the kind of deep obscurity that's necessary for effective intelligence agents. He had a yearning for publicity and the limelight. And it wasn't long before he was back in the United States co-writing McCarthy and His Enemies with his brother-in-law, L. Brent Bozell. I mentioned this book last time. It's really the only, even remotely intellectually plausible defence of McCarthyism that was ever written, where he made the claim that McCarthy was hardening a consensus which pre-existed, and that, blunt as he might be, McCarthy was right on the question that America is at war with communism. He launched National Review in 1955, and it soon became the flagship journal of the new conservative movement. He understood the need for heavy funding, and recognised also that political magazines of this type nearly always make a loss in their early years, and sometimes they always make a loss, that in effect they have to be subsidised if they're going to keep going. His family's connections, their own wealth, and very skillful fundraising among conservative businessmen made it possible. He had an entree into many high places. His father and his political friends were able to help him, and he gathered enough money to create the journal and potentially to run it for the first 5 or 6 years, even if it were to make fairly serious financial losses. Among the important figures working at the journal right from the outset were the ex-communists James Burnham and Frank Mayer. As I mentioned previously, lots of people, of whom Whittaker Chambers is the most famous, who had been communists, became passionate anti-communists in the 1950s and drew on their memory of how communism operated to write the most effective conservative condemnations of it. James Burnham had a regular column in National Review called The Third World War, in which he said, the United States is at war with the Soviet Union. Luckily, at the moment, it's not leading to millions of casualties, but we've always got to be ready for the moment when that time comes. He traced the foreign policy and great power diplomacy among the nations in the late 50s and early 60s. Frank Mayer was more interested in domestic affairs, and particularly interested in finding a way to bring together the libertarians and the traditionalists in the conservative movement who were working uneasily together in the new conservatism. That Mayer said, libertarians can actually benefit from the way in which traditionalists see the world, and traditionalists can benefit from the libertarians' insight. They do in fact have things in common, even though it might not seem so at first glance. Traditionalists should admit the desirability of a profitable and productive free market economy, which makes America strong. But on the other hand, libertarians should admit that adherence to tradition creates the stability and the moral structure within which capitalism operates. And, he said, both of them hate modern liberalism and they hate communism even more. So in practice, this is the basis of a working arrangement. Now, the name given to this combination was fusionism, and gradually it became the standard wisdom at National Review. Among William Buckley's many talents was that he had an eye for good new talents in journalism. And many people who subsequently became famous writers in America started out at National Review. Two examples are Gary Wills and Joan Didion. Gary Wills was a Jesuit seminarian, aged just 23, when he wrote his first article for National Review. It was a wickedly effective satire on Time magazine, a parody of the very special style Time used in the 1950s. Gary Wills sent it in, and on the strength of it, Buckley invited him to a summer internship on the magazine. and described later his astonishment at the discovery of just how young Wills was and the fact that he was a Jesuit seminarian. Wills later left the seminary rather than join the priesthood, and he became one of the National Review regulars from the late 50s through till the mid or late 1960s. Although he then finished a PhD and doubled as a classics professor at Johns Hopkins University. Later on, he split with National Review, but they always remained on affectionately combative terms. One of Buckley's early cultural reviewers was Joan Didion. Later on, she became one of the most distinguished novelists and new journalists and essayists of the 1960s, specialising in a characteristic style of putting herself into the stories she was writing about rather than maintaining an ostensibly neutral, detached tone. Buckley was able to persuade Russell Kirk and Whittaker Chambers, the two most famous conservative writers of the 1950s, to contribute regularly. Kirk used to mail his contributions in from Mecosta, Michigan, the village where he lived like an old squire, usually writing on educational controversies and fashionable educational follies. Now, National Review quickly began to gather a loyal readership. Pat Buchanan, who later on was himself to become an important political figure in the conservative movement, later wrote this: James Burnham, Frank Mayer, Russell Kirk, Whittaker Chambers, John Chamberlain and Bill Buckley not only believed as I had come to believe, they wrote with passion, insight and authority. Not content to contradict what passed for the conventional wisdom, they lampooned and ridiculed it. They did not politely disagree with the liberal establishment, they lacerated it. It is difficult to exaggerate the debt conservatives of my generation owe National Review. It was our only source of political and intellectual sustenance, which showed by its style that conservatism did not have to mean stuffy, orthodox, Republican stand-pat-ism. They were very, very opposed to President Eisenhower and didn't regard what Eisenhower called modern republicanism as at all compatible with their idea of what conservatism should be. Apart from anything else, Eisenhower was a specialist in conciliation in both domestic and foreign policy. Eisenhower's main interest in foreign policy was to coexist with the Soviet Union. But Buckley's view was, we can't coexist with an adversary like this whose intention is to destroy us. So when President Eisenhower invited Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, to come to America in 1959, Buckley bitterly and publicly denounced both Khrushchev himself and Eisenhower for giving the invitation. He spoke to a packed protest rally at Carnegie Hall, denouncing Khrushchev as the butcher of Budapest. This was a reference to the anti-communist uprising in Budapest in Hungary in 1956, when, to the horror of the new conservatives, the American government failed to intervene to support the Hungarian revolutionaries, as a result of which the Russian tanks soon rolled in, exterminated the leaders and reimposed an iron communist regime. Outrageous, in Buckley's opinion, that Eisenhower should then invite the man who did that, Khrushchev, to come and speak. He said it was a catastrophic mistake. Buckley, in fact, denied the principle of peaceful coexistence. In his view, the conflict between America and the Soviet Union was the war for Western civilization. Anything the Soviet Union favoured, the United States should oppose on principle. Now, the National Review was unmoved by the civil rights movement, which is again one of the great developing news stories of the 1950s and early 60s, because they feared that it might be the entering wedge of more big government. Just after National Review began publication, the Montgomery bus boycott began, the movement which first brought Martin Luther King Jr. to fame and publicity. And characteristically, National Review published an article saying, if the bus company in Montgomery doesn't give the kind of service the customers want, well, the bus company's got to find a way to provide a better service. In other words, they were cautiously sympathetic. But this didn't mean that they favoured desegregation. Instead, they published a succession of articles by white Southerners who argued that race relations had always been happy and contented and conflict-free until Northern agitators stirred things up. Buckley himself wrote that the whites were more civilized in the South and were therefore entitled to rule. Rather than more voters, which was one of the objectives of the civil rights movement, Buckley said, how about having fewer voters with more stringent literacy tests, not just for African Americans, but for everyone? You can see here the influence of Albert J. Nock on him and his belief that voters ought to have some special, give some special evidence of being educated before they should be allowed to vote at all. Later on, he was to express regret at his levity about this issue. But throughout the early days of the civil rights movement, National Review was consistently unsentimental about the civil rights movement. When, for example, in 1963, King was imprisoned in Birmingham, the scene of the attacks by fire hoses and police dogs, King wrote the Letter from Birmingham Jail, which became one of the most famous documents of the civil rights movement. But Gary Wills wrote a devastating critique of the letter in National Review, taking it line by line and saying King misunderstands the various philosophers and religious leaders whom he's quoting. Wills's conclusion? That it was empty sloganeering, marred by an almost total lack of intellectual rigour. Still, soon after that, Wills started showing that he was thinking about the growing racial crisis in a way which was unusual among his conservative contemporaries. Most of them hated the idea of affirmative action, which began to be discussed in the 1960s. But Gary Wills said, look, as conservatives, if we want to take the benefits of the past, we've got to take responsibility for the problems of the past as well. Here's how he expressed it. Conservatives are bound to accept the concept of historic guilt for racial wrongs, since those who glory in inherited values and traditions must admit accountability for historic wrongs. That was one of the points over which he was going to deviate from National Review. Well, Buckley, in his early life, had liked the idea of becoming a major conservative writer, but in fact he was temperamentally unsuited to doing sustained philosophical or political science work. Instead, he was a journalist who responded best to quick deadlines and to the crises of the moment. The nearest he ever came to writing a general statement of his philosophy was in the book Up From Liberalism, published in 1959. And of course, it's a parody of Booker T. Washington's old title, Up From Slavery. Up From Liberalism is a mixture of old articles that are strung together, filled in with some attempts at systematic political philosophy. And the book is his diagnosis of the malady of liberalism. It was common in the 50s for liberal writers to treat the new conservatives as victims of a kind of pathology. And in this book, Buckley returns the favour, saying, what is it about these liberals? Why are they so mentally unhinged? He once joked that liberals are people who doubt their principles even while they're acting on them. And here's a quotation from the book. Liberals tend to believe that the human being is perfectible and social progress predictable, and that the instrument for effecting the two is reason, that truths are transitory and empirically determined, that equality is desirable and attainable through the action of state power, that social and individual differences, if they are not rational, are objectionable and should be scientifically eliminated, that all peoples and societies should strive to organise themselves upon a rationalist and scientific paradigm. Well, Buckley claimed that those were the characteristic beliefs of contemporary liberalism. And he then went on to say how, in his opinion, each one of them was false. But he rarely stayed at this level of abstraction for very long. He enjoyed immediate debate more than meditation on first principles. And he already recognised by about 1960 that he certainly was not cut out for the life of a cloistered intellectual, just as he hadn't been cut out for the life of a CIA agent. In the early 60s, he took a calculated risk in denouncing the John Birch Society. It was a decision which won him a little bit more respectability among the rest of the media, but cost him a lot of readers and a lot of financial backers, who were people who were themselves either sympathisers or actively members of the John Birch Society. The hostile reviews of Atlas Shrugged, which he ran, I read one of them to you in a previous lecture, the bitterly hostile review by Whittaker Chambers, another one mocking Rand by Gary Wills. These also proved expensive because there were lots of intense Rand fans who were reading National Review and then gave up in disgust. But still, that act showed that Buckley was willing to police the boundaries and to exclude cranks from conservatism as he conceived it. And in the long run, the movement and certainly the journal itself probably benefited from those decisions. Now, the political candidate whom the New Conservatives around National Review liked best was Barry Goldwater. He was a conservative Republican, a United States Senator from Arizona, and he became an attractive potential presidential candidate and won National Review's support in the Republican primaries of 1960. The Republican Party had been disappointed by Eisenhower. They'd hoped in the 1952 election that Robert Taft would become the Republican presidential candidate. But the party, in fact, chose Eisenhower, who was a war hero and very, very popular throughout the nation. Taft was a principled conservative, but was very uncharismatic. Whereas Ike, the previously apolitical man, was a glamorous war hero. And it certainly made sense from the party's point of view to choose Eisenhower. Goldwater was a handsome World War II veteran and a successful businessman. He advocated pushing away the heavy hand of government, which, said Goldwater, ever since the New Deal has become far, far too widespread and is more and more constricting the freedom of American citizens. He was a hardline cold warrior, favouring not the policy of containment, which had been the standard foreign policy of Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, but rather rollback, that is, forcing the communists back and liberating from their grip territories which they'd conquered from the Nazis. Brent Bozell, who'd co-written McCarthy and His Enemies with Buckley, now ghost-wrote Goldwater's book, The Conscience of a Conservative, which was published in 1960 and became his manifesto for the next few years. It was a book which promised more freedom and less government, and rolling back the heritage of the New Deal. Here's a quotation from the book, in which Bozell, posing as Goldwater, says this: "I have little interest in streamlining government or in making it more efficient, for I mean to reduce its size. I do not undertake to promote welfare, for I propose to extend freedom. My aim is not to pass laws, but to repeal them. It is not to inaugurate new programs, but to cancel old ones that do violence to the Constitution, or that have failed in their purpose, or that impose on the people an unwarranted financial burden. I will not attempt to discover whether legislation is needed before I have first determined whether it is constitutionally permissible. And if I should later be attacked for neglecting my constituents' interests, I shall reply that I was informed their main interest is liberty, and that in that cause I'm doing the very best I can." Well, Goldwater made a respectable showing in the 1960 Republican primaries, but then yielded to the Republican frontrunner, Vice President Richard Nixon, who had in effect got the nod from Eisenhower to be his successor. But then in the election itself, Nixon very, very narrowly lost to John F. Kennedy in a contested election, probably the closest in American history until the 2000 election, which had to be decided by the Supreme Court. The conservative movement itself grew rapidly stronger in the early 1960s. Buckley presided over the formation of the Young Americans for Freedom, the YAF, an important conservative youth group founded in 1960. He'd already helped to found another group, ISI, the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists, back in 1953, and had been its first president. ISI still exists. It's now called the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. The Young Americans for Freedom held its founding convention at his house in Sharon, Connecticut. There's no question that Buckley's wealth and his ability to entertain people and his ability to spend a lot of money and his ability to invoke high political connections, all these things greatly helped and enabled him to get involved in many aspects of conservative organising. But he'd quite rightly seen that his ability to recruit young people to the conservative movement was going to be essential if it were to prosper and thrive. Buckley's friend M. Stanton Evans drafted the manifesto of this new movement, and it's called the Sharon Statement. Here's what it says: "In this time of moral and political crises, it is the responsibility of the youth of America to affirm certain eternal truths. We as young conservatives believe that foremost among the transcendent values is the individual's use of his God-given free will, whence derives his right to be free from the restrictions of arbitrary force. That liberty is indivisible, and that political freedom cannot long exist without economic freedom. That the purpose of government is to protect those freedoms through the preservation of internal order the provision of national defence and the administration of justice. That the market economy, allocating resources by the free play of supply and demand, is the single economic system compatible with the requirements of personal freedom and constitutional government, and that it is at the same time the most productive supplier of human needs. That when government interferes with the work of the market economy, it tends to reduce the moral and physical strength of the nation. That when it takes from one to bestow on another, it diminishes the incentive of the first, the integrity of the second, and the moral autonomy of both. And then it ends with an anti-communist flourish. In other words, the Sharon Statement, this founding document of the Young Americans for Freedom, was very strong on libertarian themes and strong on anti-communism, had some religious overtones, but was much weaker about tradition. All these movements were balancing the various themes which had played into the new conservatism. The Young Americans for Freedom held a huge rally at Madison Square Garden in 1962 and provided many of the foot soldiers for Goldwater's next bid for the presidency, which came in 1964. Now later on there were going to be tensions inside this movement, the Young Americans for Freedom, between its anti-communist wing, who, at the time of the Vietnam War, were in favour of the draft, and its libertarian wing, who were against the draft because they saw it as a form of government coercion. Interestingly, the Young Americans for Freedom had more members but drew far less press attention than the left-wing youth movement of the same years, SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society. YAF was always much bigger than SDS. But historians, most of whom came out of the left, have paid much more attention to the founding statement of Students for a Democratic Society, the Port Huron Statement of 1962, which was written by one of that movement's leaders, Tom Hayden. The Port Huron Statement is 100 times as long as the Sharon Statement, and it's full of murky ruminations about alienation and loneliness in the contemporary world. Barry Goldwater won the Republican presidential nomination in 1964, to the consternation of liberal Republicans. The Republican convention at the San Francisco Cow Palace that summer had the mood of an evangelical revival, and young conservatives were wildly excited to see that their candidate had in fact won the nomination. After that, Goldwater's campaigning was almost defiantly tactless, and he certainly made himself vulnerable to accusations of extremism. For example, in his acceptance speech after being nominated, he said, "I would remind you that extremism in the defence of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." Well, of course, after a remark like that, it was easy for unfriendly opponents to depict him as an extremist. And one of Lyndon Johnson's television ads implied that Goldwater, if he were elected, would launch a nuclear war and therefore end life on Earth. It shows a little girl in the foreground taking the petals off a flower, and she's counting down gently, but gradually her voice morphs into that of a very threatening military voice, counting down 10, 9, 8, and when it gets to 0, a great nuclear explosion lights up. And the implication is, this is going to be the effect of voting for Barry Goldwater. His use of the language of extremism had certainly partly brought it on himself. But his campaigning certainly violated all the conventional rules of politics at the time. He promised an end to farm subsidies, even though the farm states were heavily Republican and lived on these subsidies. He considered ending Social Security, one of the controversial programs of the New Deal. But he made the mistake of discussing it among retirees in Florida, many of whom lived on Social Security. Goldwater consistently overestimated citizens' actual commitment to freedom over security. A lot of citizens found that they liked being secure, and that freedom, if it exposed them to the harsh winds of competition and vulnerability, might not be quite so good. In any case, Lyndon Johnson had this great advantage. In November 1964, it was just about a year after the assassination of President Kennedy, and Johnson had put on the mantle of the martyred president. It's doubtful whether any Republican could have beaten him in 1964, and certainly in the event he won a stunning victory over Goldwater. Conservatives began a grassroots campaign to take over the Republican Party in the mid and late 1960s. And it was a campaign which had profound long-term consequences. The Goldwater movement had begun a seismic shift that would culminate in the election of President Reagan in the election of 1980.